Good evening. When an individual is living the ordinary, everyday human life as we ordinarily know it, and for one reason or another is turned to the spiritual life or to a search for God, or, as many of us have had happen to us, been turned to a metaphysical teaching, it is not that we are seeking the light, but that the light is seeking to break through us. And it isn't really seeking to break through us. It is that the light is always there, always available, and in one way or another we have come to be prepared for the inflow of that light. In the same way, collectively, this light of spiritual being is breaking through human consciousness, so that generation after generation we are more nearly prepared for the breaking through of this light. Our consciousness becomes more and more of a transparency through which this light can come. One of the major factors in the fact that this last 200 years shows more progress in all directions than perhaps the previous 4,000 years is undoubtedly due to the printing press. It is only about 400 years ago that the printing press began its operation, and undoubtedly it took 100 or more years before much of the material reached outside of the higher fields of learning, and probably another 100 years before newspapers and magazines and books actually reached the masses of people. As soon as people began to read, knowledge replaced ignorance. Wisdom replaced dullness. Light replaced darkness. The mind, which heretofore was engaged in no other activity than fishing and hunting, farming, hard physical labor, and sleep, now began to become active in learning. One of the first books that found wide circulation was, of course, the Bible, and this turned thought into religious avenues of one kind or another. And as other books and magazines and papers appeared, we find that the mind of individual man, the mind of the human race collectively, becomes a greater transparency. It becomes more prepared for the higher things and the better things. the grossness and dullness is removed in proportion as knowledge and wisdom enter, even when this is not yet spiritual wisdom. And because of what the mind takes in, it becomes imbued with ideas and with ideals about which it had never before heard. Of course, this advancing state of consciousness always finds opposition from the majority. It is always the nature of a majority of people to be destructive, to be restrictive, to be behind the times. And that is, as you can understand readily, because it is not the majority that is spending the most time educating themselves or opening themselves to unbiased facts. Therefore, it is always a minority that is leading the majority out of the inequalities of the past, out of the inadequacies of the past. And that is why you find that it takes a long time before we get to the place where there is a sufficient realization of the fact that we are our brother's keeper, or that we are supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves, to the extent that we actually do something about it. Within most of us, within the lifespan of most of us, we have witnessed big corporations providing hospitals and hospitalization plans for employees, whereas before that time it was a matter of, well, if you didn't save enough money for yourself, that's too bad for you. We have witnessed retirement funds and pension funds, none of which existed in my boyhood, and all of this has come out of a higher awareness, a higher consciousness, a greater feeling, a greater capacity for feeling for the needs of others. All of which is the sign that in our darkened human sense, we are utterly and completely selfish and live only unto ourselves, but that as the light of knowledge and wisdom, as the light of spiritual things comes into our experience, we begin to understand the meaning of love thy neighbor, or we are our brother's keeper, and ideas and ideals are brought forth which, again, is within your memory, have been fought by the majority and then ultimately have come through. So it is that if you look on life, the life of this world, in the past 50 years, you will see how it has advanced, not only technologically, not only with our great gadgets, not only with our greater implements of warfare, but also it has advanced in this very subject of, let's call it love, love with a capital L, manifest as a concern for our neighbor, the assumption of responsibility for those of our neighbors who cannot care for themselves, the campaigns that are always taking place leading toward the recognition of the brotherhood of man manifested in these religious brotherhoods, these combinations of Jews and Christians which circle the globe. In so many different ways, you can see all of this coming to light. Men, very important in their fields of work, very successful in their fields of work, devoting their time to doing away with capital punishment. And offhand you might say, why be so solicitous of murderers? What difference does it make what happens to them? But when you speak to these men who are engaged in this activity, you see the other side of the picture and see how very Christian their idea is and their ideals. When they say to you, we're not thinking of the murderers, we're not thinking of the criminals, we are thinking of the effect on the men and the women who subscribe to murder, who either as jurors have to sentence others, their fellow men, to death, or judges have to sentence them, or the others who have to take active part in the slaughter. In other words, the effect on the mind and soul of mankind which is combined, you might say, in this activity of murder. You might say righteous murder. There isn't any righteous murder. Perhaps you do not realize that when these men and women who partake in even that activity have succeeded, that they will almost have wiped out wars just by that one act alone of revealing to human consciousness the horror of committing murder even legally. Because isn't it a natural step from that one to the realization that we are guilty ourselves of legal murder upon our own children? We send them out to be killed and to kill, knowing that they are going out to commit murder, and for certainly no noble purpose, because the most you can say about it is that we're going to send out these young 18, 19, and 20-year lives to be snuffed out so that the 40, 50, and 60-year-olds can stay at home and prosper and be at peace. That's really the most noble thing you can say about war, is that it saves the life of the middle-aged at the expense of the lives of the young. And you can imagine the amount of hypnotism there must be in the world when parents can be hypnotized into actually believing that they are being noble when they send their children out to war. Now, it is going to take some kind of a shock to awaken mankind to what it is doing, but it has been receiving that shock. It has had 3 wars to think about. It has had the experience of Nagasaki and Hiroshima to think about. It has had the bombing of Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden, London to think about. And it is thinking. The mind of man is thinking because it has had access to all of this knowledge which heretofore has been denied to it. And so it is, then, that the light of spiritual life and living, the light of spiritual truth, is breaking into the consciousness of man through many different avenues and bringing with it a higher sense of life which we now see made manifest on earth. The original idea of Social Security was one of those human manifestations of a divine idea. That it has been abused and used as a political tool is true, but like everything else, we go from one extreme to the other, from not taking care of those who need it to providing care even for the worthy millionaires. But those are temporary things, and the adjustment will come, and the idea behind Social Security will again return to its original basis and serve a purpose which will be an outward manifestation of man's loving his neighbor as himself. It won't always be a political tool. So it is with much that you see and hear going on in the world today, some of which, of course, are at the present time abuses, but they will return again to their rightful place under a law of adjustment which inevitably takes place with man's enlightenment. Now, all of this is the result, and this is what we must understand in order to carry our work through for many generations to its ultimate conclusion. All of this is the result of the divine consciousness, which basically is our individual consciousness, now breaking through into manifestation, expression, and demonstration, so that every avenue works together for good to reveal to us the spiritual nature of life and of its formations. And this all takes place as consciousness breaks through and appears as a Bible, and it breaks through and appears as the original idea of trade unions, breaks through and appears as Social Security, breaks through and appears as a League of Nations or a United Nations. All of these outer manifestations, even though they have proven as unsatisfactory as the League of Nations did, and as the United Nations is proving to be, nevertheless, they are the outer manifestations of divine consciousness breaking through, and ultimately the ideal which was embodied in the original League of Nations and which is finding expression in the United Nations will come through into practical, universal good. When it does, try to see in your own experience that nothing happened out here in that direction until something from the invisible broke through to give us the higher ideas and the higher ideals. It doesn't take an historian to go back and find that it wasn't too long ago that nations were preying upon nations, nations overcoming nations, not for any noble purpose whatsoever, just gain, self-gain, self-interest, and that in these few brief centuries we are coming to this place of attempted brotherhood of nations. Please do not be fooled by appearances into believing that any of these activities toward good any of these higher enlightenments and the outer manifestations thereof are either accidental, incidental, or that they are merely creations of men. Behind every one of these is the spiritual consciousness of man breaking through. And it is because of this that you can safely predict that the day is on its way, and nearer than you think, of a universal peace, of a universal brotherhood of man, and that ideal day of peace on earth and goodwill to men. Do not be disturbed or alarmed when you see the errors that come in the wake of these things, such as that which you are seeing today in trade unionism, that which you are seeing today in politics. Don't be disturbed by these things as if there were any doubt of the outcome. There might be a doubt if these things were in the hands of man, but they're not. And it is fortunate indeed that these men do not know that the fate of unionism and the fate of social security and the fate of the United Nations is not at the mercy of man. It is God breaking through. And although always there will be men to resist it and pervert it, in the end, because it is an unfolding activity of the Spirit, which is God, it will come through into the fullest of fruition. Now this applies not only on a worldwide scale, but it applies on a worldwide scale because it applies on the scale of the individual. Only that which is true of the individual can ever be true on a worldwide scale. In your experience, the fact that you have been a student of truth for 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 years and have not yet found utopia should not be disturbing to you. First of all, as the first light of truth breaks through into your consciousness, it first finds enmity within you. A man's enemies are those of his own household, of those of his own consciousness. Because as the Spirit or the light of truth breaks into our consciousness, it must necessarily wipe out of us all of our human ideas and ideals. And many of these constitute what we feel is our good. And the first thing you know, we find ourselves in rebellion with the very spiritual light that would break through. If we consciously knew this, there would be no battle, or it would be brief. But since we do not know what is taking place, we do not know that we are warring against the higher spiritual ideals and instincts which are coming into our consciousness and breaking up the old man. The old man who must die daily wants to cling to life. The holding on to yesterday's manna is a human instinct that is older than Moses. Always there is the attempt to hold on to yesterday's manna. Always the natural thing is to hold on to the life that is supposed to die. In fact, we are told that the highest human instinct is the drive toward self-preservation. And of course, you see, this drive toward self-preservation is the greatest enemy of our spiritual development that can be. So just remember, the deepest, strongest human instinct is at the same time the fiercest enemy of our spiritual development. Why? What is it that we are trying to preserve of our selfhood, except that which we believe about ourselves and to be good for ourselves? And what is the height of spiritual progress? Not only dying to the self, losing one's life. So then, human instinct says self-preservation, spiritual unfoldment says lose your life. And there you have the two warring, one with the other. One, the instinct to hold on to everything that we humanly believe to be good. Do you not see on a collective scale that is why society fought unions, that is why society fought Social Security, that is why society fought United Nations or Leagues of Nations, that is why society fights the giving away of food to nations who need it? It is this idea of self-preservation. Why should we pay out money for that poor family across the track? Why should we contribute to funds for somebody in China? Before World War II, I was for a good many years on the committee of the Friends of China, trying desperately to get some of our surplus food shipped into China for the families that were starving there. And I'm sure you've seen enough photographs in magazines to know that they were just falling down on the road and dying of starvation and diseases brought on by starvation. And believe it or not, we didn't get enough food in 10 years from the big people who had it, or even from the United States government. We didn't get enough food in 10 years to give them 3 months of food. Out of all that we had, and out of all the surpluses, and out of all that we were shipping out to sea to be destroyed, there were times when we tried to get only that which the government was sending out into the Atlantic Ocean to be dumped overboard to keep it off the market. And we couldn't even get that. You see, that's called self-preservation. In the same way, you read it in the press. Why should we be sending food now? Why should we be sending our food and our money to unfriendly nations? Well, you know, there are no unfriendly nations. There may be some unfriendly people in foreign governments, but there are no unfriendly nations, and certainly starving people aren't unfriendly. But it's this idea of self-preservation. Why don't we keep it for ourselves? Where? In storehouses that we have to burn down. But the idea persists in self-preservation, and it is the enemy of our spiritual progress, which says to us, give, share, donate, sacrifice, if necessary, even lose your life for your friend. There's no higher spiritual demonstration than to lose your life for your friend. No, always the first enemy is you and me to our own spiritual progress, because we will cling to these ideas of yesterday, and we will cling to this self-preservation, and thereby set up opposition within ourselves individually and collectively. And so do not think, just to interrupt myself, do not think that I'm sitting in judgment on anybody, or criticizing, or condemning. I am revealing that which is within ourselves, which prevents our own spiritual unfoldment, and that which is delaying the spiritual unfoldment, the world peace and prosperity of all the world. Now, I'm not doing this for the purpose of judgment or criticism, but for the purpose of telling you not to lose patience with yourself and not to expect to attain utopia by the day after tomorrow, because within each one of us are these enemies that are still to be overcome, the enemies of self, self-preservation, the enemies of self in any and every form. And we of ourselves cannot overcome this. It is only as we expose ourselves to the light of truth. It is only as we fill ourselves with whether it is Scripture or the mystical writings of the world, the spiritual writings of the world, the writings of the spiritually illumined, the writings of even those who are religiously endowed intellectually. You know that the essays of Ralph Waldo Emerson are probably among the big-selling literature of the world. And why is this? Why? Because they reveal the idealism which each and every one of us has at the center of our being, but cannot yet give expression to. That is what keeps it in circulation in the tremendous amount that it is, that there are so many in whom spiritual light has begun to work. And as you read these essays and read this spiritual wisdom of the Orient, which Emerson translated for us into the Occidental language, you feel at one with it. You feel that this is your nature, this is what you hope for, this is what you live for, and it is. Even though you also acknowledge, but how far I am from living up to it. The same is true with any of the more spiritual literature of the world. Letters of a Scattered Brotherhood. Oh, so many things of that type with which you are familiar. You read it because the light which is God has already touched your soul and your mind. And as you read these inspired writings, they bring out in you a reaction of, yes, 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 this is it. You are at one with it. This is your life. This is the way you feel. Well, this is your assurance that you have been touched and that this infinite divine consciousness is breaking through and with patience will overcome the enemies within your own consciousness. It will break down for you that which would like to cling to yesterday's manna, yesterday's ideas, yesterday's ideals. Will break down within you this idea of self-preservation being the first law of nature. On the contrary, self-sacrifice is the first law of spiritual unfoldment. That is, the sacrifice of personal interest for the universal, for the divine, for the brotherhood. The Master revealed in It profiteth you nothing to pray for yourselves. You must pray for your enemies in order to be children of God. He revealed right there what it means to have that mind which was also in Christ Jesus, to have that divine consciousness in active expression. In other words, self is so deflated that one is not indulging oneself or one's time or one's prayers merely for oneself or one's friends, which constitute oneself, but has already broadened out into the love thy neighbor consciousness. You can tell the degree in which divine consciousness is becoming your individual consciousness in the degree in which your interests are less personal or involved less with purely your family or your friends and begin to include this world or begin to embrace within you an interest in this world, those of this world, the activities of this world, and the unfolding good for this world. We can tell the narrowness of our lives by the degree in which we have blinders on, so that we can see only our family, our friends, our religion. It is for this reason that I have told our students in many classes that in the years of the opening and unfolding of this message of the infinite way, 80% of all of the income that came to me went into the infinite way. But there never has been a time from the beginning when out of that 80%, 10% of it did not go into other activities of world or community interest, such as community funds or Red Cross or Boy Scouts or YMCAs or YWCAs and so forth, for this very reason, that we must not and we may not live only to self. And it is not sufficient to provide only for those who are seeking spiritual wisdom, but remember that we must love our neighbor as ourself, even if our neighbor isn't of our religious belief or even national belief. And so it is that with students who continually contribute to the activities of the infinite way, it is always brought to their attention that never must they set all of their benevolence fund or whatever their tithe may be for the infinite way without remembering to withhold part of it for these other activities which prove that our work is spiritual, in that it embraces all mankind, that the love of God takes no respect of person, and that God's rain falls on the just and the unjust. And so it is, let us remember that as the divine consciousness makes itself apparent as our individual consciousness, it must show itself forth by our interest in those things which bring to light freedom, justice, equity, equality for mankind, for this entire world. Now, I'm 7,000 miles off base from where I was going to start. And I don't know how to get back. Well, here's a way. On a tape recording, I heard you say, from the remnant that is left will come the new civilization. Please explain. Well, I think that I have explained that in what I've said here, that beginning with those, even if it begins with only one, who has an ideal of brotherhood and expresses it by bringing forth the idea of a trade union or social security or hospitalization for workers or retirement funds, or even brings it through in this new light which has hit Wall Street, of so policing the activity of the security market, not only as to bring every earner into partnership in industry, but at the same time take precautions to see that those partnerships become profits only and not losses. Even in this, a spiritual activity is made manifest in a human activity. So it is then that the remnant, that is, those few who receive these divine ideas and who give up their own personal lives in order to bring through these ideas and ideals of universal and spiritual good, this is the remnant which ultimately brings forth the new civilization. Now, in the same way, we who are engaged in a religious activity that embraces spiritual healing, we help to usher in a whole new civilization. And we do it in what must seem to you the strangest way, and would seem to the world, if it heard anything about it, as lunacy. Heretofore the world has believed that the world can only be saved as individuals are saved. In other words, that before we can get to the age of the brotherhood of man, that all of the people on earth will have to wake up and desire it and embrace it and want to live it. And that isn't true. That isn't true. A few thousand people on the face of this globe will change the history of the entire civilization. The reason is this. That which we have been talking about up to now as human consciousness, the human self, that which lives by the law of self-preservation. In other words, human consciousness. This does not have to be transformed in every individual separately and singly. It is being done by masses, and will only require a few thousand people on the face of the globe to transform all of human consciousness into people of divine consciousness. Now, before the nature of human consciousness was known, it would have been necessary to reform each individual separately. Of course, that would have been an impossible task, because by the time that you would have had 10% of them reformed, the whole 100% generation would have passed on and a new one taken its place, and you would have had to start all over again. It would never be possible to reach around the world and reach 4 billion people, all at the different levels of consciousness of which they are, and even bring spiritual light to 2,000,000,001 in order to get a majority. The only way in which the Christianization of mankind will take place, or spiritualization of mankind, will be through the activity of a remnant who know the truth and learn how to apply it and live it and watch it work on first an individual scale, later on a more collective scale. Now let me illustrate this. And of course, to make it clear, I will have to start with individuals. Let us say that we have an infinite way student who knows the principles, the specific principles, which constitute the healing message of the infinite way. Now, first of all, let me say to you that these principles are not to be found in any truth teachings other than the infinite way. They are not to be found in any other metaphysical movement. These that I am talking about are to be found only in the infinite way, and until a student comes to recognize them and to be able to work with them, they cannot bring out the fruitage, the results that are possible. Let me take just one of these principles, and incidentally the one which is responsible for my entire success for 16 years as a healing practitioner and 14 years in bringing about the unfoldment of the infinite way worldwide. There are a half a dozen principles which are entirely infinite way principles and have been revealed to me, put into work. But there are 2 or 3 which are major and which produce miracle results when they're understood. But they must be understood, they must be practiced until one develops the consciousness of them. And I'm going, just for illustration, to give you the first one. And that is the impersonal nature of all evil. Now this is a complete contradiction not only to all religious teachings, but to every one of the metaphysical teachings of the world. Because in all of these teachings, it is your wrong thinking, or it is your jealousy, or your envy, or your greed, or your lust that's causing the trouble. Always it's you who are at fault for your sins or your diseases or your lack. There isn't a teaching on the face of the globe that doesn't insist that all your trouble begins with you. And all of them are aimed at changing you, reforming you, making you better, or taking you from wrong thinking to right thinking, so forth and so on. One of the very first revelations ever given to me in healing work was that not one word of this is true, that all evil has its source in an impersonal cause that has nothing to do with you. You are merely the victim of it through your ignorance of this truth. So that if a person lies or steals or cheats or defrauds, they are not the cause or the responsible one for their sins. They are the victims of their ignorance of this truth, that the evil that men do is not their sin. It is an imposed condition thrust into their consciousness which they have not learned to reject. If you watch the master standing with the devil before him, the devil offering him the three wonderful temptations, and then watch as the master says, "Get thee behind me, Satan," you will understand what I mean. The master knew that he was being tempted, but he knew he wasn't tempting himself. He knew that these temptations were no part of his nature. They were no part of his being. Therefore, when he is tempted with them, he can say, "Get thee behind me, Satan." My nature doesn't include greed, lust, mad ambition. My nature doesn't include covetousness. Therefore, when those emotions appear in him, he can recognize them as the works of the devil, the temptation of an impersonal source, and he can say, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Through the infinite way, we can do the same thing. Every time that we are tempted to indulge anything that we recognize as foreign to our own spiritual nature, we can instantly reject it with that realization. You are no part of me. You are no part of the divinity of me. You are no part of that which God implanted in me. Therefore, you are a temptation, and I have the power to reject you. You have no power over me. It may be even a temptation to be sick. We still have the power to recognize that sickness is no part of a man created in the image and likeness of God. If we take seriously the message and the mission of the Master, we must know that the will of God for man is life and eternal health and eternal, health and eternal life. Health and eternal life, because the Master came to do the will of God. And to prove that he came to do the will of God, he healed the sick and raised the dead. Therefore, health and immortality is the natural state, the God-given state of your being. Therefore, when a temptation comes to accept sickness, instead of saying, "Now let me look into my mind and see what caused it," let us go back to our birth. Call no man on earth your father. Only one is your parent, the Father in heaven. And what is my heritage? Health and eternal life. Therefore, sickness can be no part of my being, and this comes to me as a temptation to accept for myself that which is no part of my being. If you work faithfully with yourself, you will reverse all that you have ever been taught about having been born in sin, having been created in sin and brought forth in iniquity. Because you will begin to acknowledge that God alone is your parent and you are spiritually evolved. That which we know as human creation is but the visible manifestation of a divine activity. Now, once you claim for yourself that heritage of birth, how are you ever going to look into your mind to see what caused your disease? How are you going to accuse yourself of envy, jealousy, malice, hate, lust, animality, greed, fear? How are you going to do that? And you will know that this whole teaching has been wrong from the beginning, which places the source of your troubles in your wrong human qualities or thinking, and you will begin to perceive why the infinite way has so completely gone around the world in only 14 years. It has done so on the seed within itself, which is this great revelation that all evil is impersonal. When you accomplish a few healings through this realization, you will begin to apply this principle to your members of your household. And whereas before you have looked at them and regretted the evil and erroneous traits that you witness in them, and whereas before you may have wished and prayed with all your heart that they could be changed, you'll stop wasting time. And now you'll begin to rejoice that none of these things were ever true about them. All of this had its source in a universal, impersonal source, which of old they called the devil, as when Jesus faced him, which Paul later called carnal mind, which metaphysics today calls mortal mind. It makes no difference what terminology you use. You might call it just universal hypnotism. You could call it universal belief. You can go back to mortal mind, carnal mind, devil if you like. Really makes no difference, as long as you understand that it is not only impersonal, but has no power, since it is not of God.